Ukraine has hit Russia with one of the deepest strikes of the entire war, going after the Shahed drones at their source. Plus, they've continued to grind down Russian oil production, and we're going to talk about Ukraine's changes to their conscription policy and NATO's $100 billion fund, maybe. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all of it. Okay. First off, this is, to me, I think the biggest story. Ukrainian drone has hit Russia's third largest oil refinery. This is the Tenenko refinery. It is almost 1,300 kilometers, 800 miles from the front line. So a really deep strike attack by Russia or by Ukrainian forces. And it's been part of a larger Ukrainian campaign targeting the Russian oil production. The reason is, of course, the Russian war machine is run on oil, not literally, literally on Russian oil, but also more importantly, Russia's ability to sell oil internationally. That raises the funds that are used to fund the Russian military. So Ukraine has been targeting them. Now, up until this point, it hasn't been said explicitly, but it's fairly clear that as a contingent of U.S. aid to Ukraine, they've said, listen, you can't target Russian oil refineries. The reason is, of course, the U.S., it's an election year, and the incumbent president and party really has been getting raked over the coals on inflation, something that has hit the average American very heavily. And so by damaging Russian oil production, Ukraine is inadvertently raising the global price of oil, right? Supply and demand, Ukraine reducing the global supply. And as a result, that would raise the price of oil internationally. And if the market expects these attacks to continue, then you're going to see the price rise even higher. Now, that means that it's going to cost more for the average American to purchase almost any good, right? Because this fuel runs ships, it runs trucks, it's used in a lot of production for plastics. So there is a ton of fossil fuel or ton of oil that goes into almost everything. And so that means that it's going to come back and hit the American consumer, right? So, but here's the problem. In order to get a country, particularly a country like Ukraine, who's in the middle of an existential war, to do anything, you have to have a carrot and a stick. You have to give them an incentive. And the U.S. aid was so rich, so appealing, that they were willing to agree to fight on the U.S.'s terms, which included actually no U.S. gear used in Russian sovereign territory and a whole host of other contingencies. But now that that aid has dried up, Ukraine has said, we cannot allow ourselves to be constrained by the requirements this ally has put on us. And so that's why they've gone after Russian oil refineries. And you notice, too, that when Ukraine ramped up the pressure on Russian oil, suddenly the U.S.'s ability to pass that military aid was a lot more open. Why? Maybe Russia wanted to see Ukraine get put back on the U.S. leash, who the U.S. would prevent Ukraine from escalating this war into dangerous directions. But also, Russia was like, yo, we got to stop these guys from striking our oil refineries, which to me is a sign that they should keep doing it. But that's not all that Russia hit, right? That Ukraine hit. Ukraine also used a new type of drone called a UJ-22. And the UJ-22, this was a drone pioneered by Ukrainian's military intelligence, which actually appears to be a single-engine, commercial aircraft retrofitted as an attack drone, and it targeted a Russian oil refinery in this city of, God help me, Nizhny, but also, right, we just talked about, but also a military drone production site in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone. And what's interesting about this is that the drones ended up hitting a workers' dormitory. Now, what this is, we talked about this actually a few months ago, that in July, many of these, they say college students, they're more like young adults engaging in work. They're engaging in work. They're factory workers. Reported that this factory is engages in the assembly of Iranian Shahed drones, which are produced at the factory, right? Now, some have even said that these quote unquote students were forced to work at the factory under difficult conditions, paid very little, and parents threatened with huge fines if their children refused to work. But what's interesting is that this is a sign that Ukraine has begun targeting the source of the Shahed drones. And it's also a sign that while this increased cooperation between Iran and Russia is continuing to go on, it's also a sign that production, at least Iranian production, is not sufficient to meet the need. And the fact that Russia is opening its own factories is a sign that, one, Russia plans on scaling up their use of the Shahed drones, but it also creates an opportunity that Ukraine is exploiting to hit those factories, right? So a really interesting development, certainly, and I think probably for the best, right? Even if all it serves is to slow and not stop the production of these Shaheds, it's still going to make a tremendous difference to Ukrainian forces who, again, see these Shaheds on a routine basis, almost a weekly basis. They see these Shahed strikes targeting infrastructure. Anyway, guys, if you need a secret weapon, you don't have to design a giant commercial aircraft drone, right? You can just use Strike Gum to achieve what you want to. Strike Gum, of course, is the energy drink alternative, right? It's better than the energy drinks you get at the gas station in basically every way. Each piece has more caffeine than a Red Bull or an Amp Energy. 0 sugar, refreshing mint flavor, so your breath doesn't smell weird and gross, and 100 milligrams of alpha GPC for further cognitive enhancement. And like, you can go to strikegum.com. We have new user discounts. We got military and first responder discounts. We have a whole bunch. And best of all, you can get us on Amazon. And a huge thank you to the dozens of people who've written, left us 5-star reviews on Amazon. You know that is a game changer. So you guys who've done it, thank you so much. If you're going to order some and you love Strike Gum, please let us know over there on Amazon. We love to hear it. Okay, now let's talk about some other interesting stories, right? First, Ukraine lowering its conscription age to 25, down from 27. Now, you may think, oh, in the United States and almost every other country, conscription begins at 18. And it's true. Ukraine has a very different policy in order to not sort of create this, like, so in Russia, right, they have this 18 is when you become eligible for conscription. The problem is that a lot of wealthy families can exploit that system, right? They say, well, my young man is in college and he can't do this, or, they work around it and they use wealth and connection to do it. And I suspect that Ukraine designed this system originally to say, okay, everybody gets their young adulthood, but then at 27, this is where, in the event of a war, we'll start to conscript you. And we've seen it. I think there actually has a lot of advantages. Ukrainian troops seem to be more mature. They seem to be very adult in how they take the task and how they learn, right? You don't have to instill the seriousness of training into these older troops. So I think there's actually some advantage to it. But we've talked about the fact that Kiev has a hard time replacing its soldiers, right? Soldiers that are wounded or killed. And so dropping the conscription age 2 years will open up a larger number of Ukrainian men who are eligible to serve. Now, as we've talked about, right, Ukraine's conscription leaves a lot to be desired, right? The quality of the troops seems low. They get very little say in where they serve. And for a lot of able-bodied young men, a lot more seem to be going direct to the units, right? Units now have their own recruitment offices, and the units solve many of the problems that the Ukrainian government cannot. The units will sit there and say, you can choose your job, you can choose your role, we'll provide you the training, you know the unit you're going to go to, right? Because that would be awful, right? To go to an absolutely garbage unit once you've completed your training, it's just not worth it, right? And so knowing those things, I think you're going to see this is going to push a lot of those 25 and 26-year-olds not so much to allow themselves to be conscripted, but more likely to contact these units and say, listen, I heard you're looking for drone pilots. I heard you're looking for mechanics. I heard you're looking for medics. And that, again, is a better solution. Because, again, when you're recruiting somebody who's 25, let's say they've been, let's say they worked as an EMT for 6 years. Well, why would you make them be a tank crew member or an infantryman, right? You should make them be a medic because they already have 80% of the training under their belt, right? Let's say somebody was a programmer, right? We looked at an earlier video where they interviewed a drone open source analyst, and she says, oh yeah, I was working for an IT company before. She's like, I do the exact same thing. Do the same thing. I was a program manager. Now the program is just finding and killing Russians, but I manage it just the same. I swear a little more. So I think that ability, I hope that's coming, the ability to try to leverage people's desires and their special experiences to maximize their contribution to the war effort is huge. Right. And what's interesting is that Zelensky actually ordered an audit of the troops to try to get an estimate of just how many troops are needed to sustain the war effort. Zelensky said he wasn't ready to tell journalists how many conscripts the Ukrainian army will need, but the previous estimate was about 500,000 new recruits. So I think overall it's a positive move for Ukraine. Again, something that I find a little strange that Russia seems to have a more robust and effective conscription cycle system than Ukraine does. But they're catching up. And here's the other story that I thought was really interesting. And this is a proposal, right? NATO proposes a lot of things, right? You can count on, if there's one thing you can count on, especially like European-facing bureaucrats, these guys love to propose things. They've proposed every possible thing under the sun, someone has proposed, right? And it's cheap. Anyone can propose anything. And so it sounds like someone in Brussels, actually NATO boss Jens Stoltenberg, has proposed a 100 billion euro 5-year package of military aid to Ukraine, right, that would give NATO a more direct role in providing the support to Kiev. But what's interesting is that the plan would involve NATO taking over some of the coordination work that's currently run by a U.S.-led kind of ad hoc coalition called the Ramstein Group. And this is meant to help put an administrative barrier. If the U.S. decides to cut funding, it's still, because NATO funding is protected in a lot of ways that support to something like Ukraine directly is not, right? There is no treaty that says the U.S. has to support Ukraine, but there is a treaty that says the U.S. has to support NATO. And so by making this support to Ukraine a NATO project, it would allow some of that funding from the U.S. to be better protected from cancellation or suspension by a president who doesn't support it or by a party who doesn't support it. And again, it would be really, really helpful to do so, though until now, NATO as an organization has restricted itself to actually non-lethal aid. I didn't know this, out of fears that a more direct role could trigger an escalation with Russia. But here's the problem. I don't know if you guys noticed this. Putin already blames NATO for everything, for all lethal aid that's gone to Ukraine. So the fact that they have this symbolic fig leaf is only made NATO less effective. It hasn't made Russia more deterred. Most of the weapons are provided, they call bilaterally, which means direct from France to Ukraine, from the U.S. to Ukraine. But diplomats have actually said that there's been more and more consensus that military aid needs to be on a sustainable long-term footing and that NATO was meant to take on this role. And it's true. This is exactly what NATO was meant for, right? NATO was meant to, it is first and foremost a mutual defense pact, but it is also a military alliance, right? NATO famously went into Afghanistan under the ISAF banner, and that is not a direct one. Like Afghanistan did not directly attack NATO, and it was not a mission and it's not on a NATO country's borders, but because it was a mission that the entire NATO alliance viewed as essential to its security, it collectively engaged in that operation. And so a similar argument could certainly be made for Ukraine, that supporting Ukraine in its fight against Russia has a larger strategic role for NATO and therefore justifies NATO collectively providing lethal aid. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you. A huge thank you to the members at combatvetnews.com. We checked out some of the footage from this largest Russian attack of the year. That was actually leaked, and we did some analysis of it 2 days ago. If you're a member, you know what I'm talking about. And if you're not a member, you really should become one. It's the best way to support the channel. But you can also hit like on the video and subscribe. That way the YouTube algorithm knows that I'm a legit creator and not some crazy person. See ya. Cheers.